Chapter 12. New Sand. Guillaume sat on the cool Southampton beach, gathering, piling, and pushing sand into some special shape that only he understood. He pressed white seashells into the side of the mysterious lump of sand for decoration. Never far away, Albert and Renee walked slowly up the beach toward him. Holding hands, they stared at Guillaume's work for a while. "What is it, Gigi?" asked Albert. "Is it a castle?" asked Renee. Looking a little upset, Guillaume frowned and molded one part of the sand lump, adjusting its shells. Then he looked at them, as if that shift would make his work very obvious. "I'm sorry," said Albert. "I still don't know what it is." "It's a burr cow, isn't it?" tried Renee, grimacing in fear of guessing incorrectly again. "Frumudi Belegay," he insisted angrily and walked off in a huff. Not having the least idea what he was talking about, the girls just stared at each other and held back a giggle. They stood and watched as Guillaume headed back to the Martineau's cottage. "What's a Frumodi Billogy?" Albert giggled to her sister. "If you tilt your head this way and squint your eyes," suggested Renee, "then you can clearly see that it's a sheepdog covered with tall trees." With that, they too headed back up to the cottage. Spring was now upon Southampton, which had been home for the Martineaus for over 6 months. The cold English winter, which they weren't at all used to, had gripped the city and all its Huguenots refugees for several long months. But they had all come through with only minor illnesses. Soon after they arrived, Father and Uncle Felipe had opened a silk shop in the center of town. Though a farmer at heart, Uncle Felipe had discovered that the farmland in South England was very different than La Rochelle, so he had quickly adapted his skills to the fabric trade. Since Southampton served as one of the prime harbors for English trade, Father and Uncle Felipe had been able to send out their work to places all around the world, though the English government seemed to have almost as many rigid trade rules as the French government. Uncle Felipe, Aunt Catherine, and all their children lived a short way from the Martineau's cottage. The local Huguenot refugees had all helped the two families get set up and started almost immediately upon arrival. As well, the residents of Southampton were known for their special kindness to the Huguenots. Long before the residents of Southampton had provided Huguenots with a place to worship at St. Julian's Chapel, a part of an old and beautiful building known as God's House Tower, which overlooked the harbor. Mother, Aunt Catherine, and Mary did the best at learning English, though everyone followed suit, except Guillaume and, of course, Phoebe. Because of Mary's skills at English, she often helped out in the fabric store and was well liked by all the customers. During one of the colder parts of the winter, after a particularly good week of trading silk, Father brought home a package for Mary. He said that he had sat through too many evenings without the sound of Mary's beautiful music. When Mary opened the package, expecting a flute, she instead found a beautiful violin. She almost fainted, and soon thereafter she was regularly by her cousin Elizabeth's side, learning as much as she could. Elizabeth had left her violin behind at the farmhouse, but Uncle Philippe had brought home a package for her the same night Mary received hers. From the very beginning, Abraham worked diligently at the fabric shop, learning even more and getting better at his trade, but he still wanted to study at a university. And after many encouraging discussions with Father and the elders in Southampton, Abraham desired to pursue the ministry and work towards serving as a pastor. He was well aware of many of the difficulties that the ministry promised, but his heart burned to serve in the church. He remembered and was ashamed at so many of the Huguenot pastors that had so easily recanted their faith. The church needed more faithful teachers like Pastor Delone. So the family planned to have Abraham continue working through the year at the fabric shop, and then they would send him to study for the ministry at the French University in Edinburgh, Scotland. He could hardly wait. Mother was busier than ever. At the beginning of winter, she took in several young French girls from among the church families and began tutoring them in music, Latin, writing, and sewing. They had to stop for several months because the weather was too cold and the Martineau's cottage was outside of town. But now that spring had arrived, the families wanted their girls to return to their studies under Madame Martineau. This time, Renee and Albert would join in on the lessons as well, something they had long begged to do. Renee and Albert liked any season of the year, making the best out of any climate. But spring held a special place in their hearts, as it does for many people. No sooner had they arrived at Southampton than they had been forced to remain indoors most of the time due to the winter. They had not had any time to explore the area around their cottage. But now with spring beginning, they spent most of their days looking for seashells, examining sea creatures, and watching waves. They had quite a collection of seashells and had adorned Mother with probably a chest full of seashell necklaces. Best of all, Father had cleared an area along the side of the cottage where the twins could plant and tend a garden of their own. Since the climate was so different, the garden would have to be different too. They would have to learn about the vegetables and fruits that did well in the Southampton climate, which had much less sunshine than La Rochelle. Mother asked some of the Huguenot ladies from the church who had raised several gardens of their own to come over and explain the differences between gardens in England and those in France. The girls learned quickly, and soon they had planted all types of fruits and vegetables. Some of these they had never known before, so they couldn't wait to see what the seeds produced. After Renee and Albert left Guillaume's sand lump and returned to the cottage, they played with Phoebe for a while, who was now able to sit up by herself and lean against furniture. Aunt Catherine had come over with all her daughters for English tea time, a new custom for these women of La Rochelle. Mother had made delicious pastries for everyone. After tea, Father came home and peeked his head into the house. He checked to see whether Renee and Albert were inside, and when he spotted them, he told them to wait there. Everyone listened in silence, wondering what Father was up to. They could hear two voices outside the thick house walls. Perhaps they were those of Father and Uncle Felipe. Finally, the cottage door creaked open again. Father stood there for a moment with his arms crossed, just looking at everyone. Mother smiled at this. "You two," said Father, sternly pointing at Renee and Albert. "Come outside." Everyone got up and followed, bunching up at the top of the front doorstep. The twins stared at Father, waiting for something, but he just stood there with his back to the waves in the distance. "Well, do you hear?" he asked them. "Waves?" guessed Albert. "No." "The city?" guessed Renee. "No." "Listen." They stepped down from the doorway toward Father, but still they could hear nothing special. Then ever so slightly they did start to hear a different sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Where had they heard that sound before? Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then they remembered. They ran around the side of the house, and there in the middle of each of their gardens, tied to two pegs, stood two wobbly midnight black lambs. They were chewing on a little pile of vegetables that Father had brought from town. "Oh, Father! Oh, Father!" the twins yelled. "These are the best gifts!" cried Albert. "Thank you so much," said Renee, squeezing her lamb around its neck. All the other children ran over to pet the new additions to the Martineau family. After a few moments, Renee and Albert ran over to Father, who was standing in the beach stand next to Mother, holding her hand, talking. The twins hugged their parents' legs. Then Renee motioned for Father to bend over so she could say something. "We remember the sand, Father," Renee said quietly. "We always will," said Albert. Father smiled deeply and, hugging them again, said, "The Lord has been very gracious to us all."